I was washing dishes when I heard someone screaming at my wife through our kitchen window. Ma'am, step away from the vehicle with your hands visible. You're under citizen's arrest for unauthorized vehicle placement. I looked outside to see a woman I'd never met before pointing what appeared to be a fake taser at my wife, who was simply trying to get groceries out of her patrol car in our own driveway. The woman was wearing a homemade community enforcement vest and had apparently decided that our county sheriff was committing some kind of parking violation on our own property. My wife Jessica slowly turned around with the kind of calm that comes from 20 years of law enforcement experience, her sheriff's badge gleaming in the afternoon sun, and said in the voice that had intimidated hardened criminals across 3 counties, "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to put that weapon down and explain what you think you're doing." The woman with the fake taser froze like someone had just told her she'd been pranking the Pope. This was going to be good. My wife Jessica Martinez has been the elected sheriff of Henderson County for 8 years, a position she'd earned after working her way up from patrol officer to detective to undersheriff over 2 decades. She's the kind of person who can defuse a domestic violence situation with words alone or chase down a fleeing suspect in high heels if necessary. She's also incredibly patient, which makes it significant when someone manages to push her past her breaking point. The woman pointing a fake weapon at the county's top law enforcement officer had apparently done exactly that. "I'm Brenda Patterson, HOA security coordinator," the woman announced, though her voice was starting to shake as she realized she might have made a tactical error. "Your vehicle is parked in violation of community standards, and I have authority to make citizens' arrests for property violations." Jessica looked at our driveway, then at her clearly marked sheriff's patrol car, then back at Brenda with the expression she usually reserved for people who tried to explain why they hadn't actually been speeding when the radar gun said otherwise. "Miss Patterson, you're currently pointing what appears to be a weapon at a law enforcement officer in her own driveway. I'm going to need you to lower that device immediately and explain what authority you believe gives you the right to arrest anyone." Brenda's confidence wavered, but she held onto her fake taser like it was a magic wand that could transform her delusions into reality. "I have community authority as established by HOA regulations. Patrol vehicles aren't allowed in residential driveways between 6 p.m. and 8 a.m. I watched through the window as Jessica's professional composure shifted into what I called sheriff mode. Her entire demeanor changed from patient homeowner to law enforcement officer dealing with a potentially dangerous situation. "Ma'am, first of all, there is no HOA in this neighborhood. Second, you're on my private property without permission. Third, you're brandishing what appears to be a weapon. And fourth, you're attempting to arrest a county sheriff for parking in her own driveway." That's when the full absurdity of the situation seemed to hit Brenda. She looked at Jessica's uniform, then at the sheriff's department patrol car, then back at her own fake taser, and I could see her brain struggling to process how badly she'd miscalculated. "You can't be the sheriff," she said weakly. "The sheriff wouldn't live in a neighborhood like this." Jessica raised an eyebrow. "What exactly do you mean by a neighborhood like this?" "I mean, well, normal people live here. The sheriff would live somewhere more official." I could see Jessica processing this logic, probably wondering if Brenda thought sheriffs lived in special government housing or maybe caves with their patrol cars. The woman clearly had some interesting ideas about how law enforcement worked. "Miss Patterson, I've lived in this house for 12 years, 6 years before I was elected sheriff and 6 years since. This is my home, that's my patrol car, and you're currently committing several crimes on my property." Brenda's grip on her fake taser tightened. "I don't care what you claim to be. You're in violation of community vehicle regulations, and I have the authority to enforce compliance." That's when Jessica's patience officially ran out. 20 years of dealing with criminals, domestic disputes, and county politics had given her an almost supernatural ability to remain calm under pressure. But Brenda had found the exact combination of stupidity and aggression that could push her past her limit. "Ma'am, you have 3 seconds to put that weapon down and step back, or you're going to be arrested for assault on a law enforcement officer, trespassing, and whatever other charges I can think of while I'm handcuffing you." Instead of complying, Brenda made the worst possible decision. She actually activated her fake taser and pointed it directly at Jessica while shouting, "I said you're under citizen's arrest. Get away from that vehicle." What happened next was like watching a nature documentary about apex predators. Jessica moved with the fluid efficiency of someone who'd been in hundreds of potentially dangerous situations, disarming Brenda and having her face down on our driveway in handcuffs before I could even get outside to help. "Brenda Patterson," Jessica said in her official voice as she secured the handcuffs, "you're under arrest for assault on a law enforcement officer, trespassing, brandishing a weapon, and impersonating an official. You have the right to remain silent." This is police brutality. Brenda screamed from the driveway. I was just enforcing community standards. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law, Jessica continued, completely ignoring Brenda's protests about community standards and police brutality. By this time, half the neighborhood had come out to see what the commotion was about. Mrs. Chun from next door was recording everything on her phone, probably already planning to post it on the neighborhood Facebook group. Tom Wilson from across the street was openly laughing at the sight of someone trying to arrest the county sheriff in her own driveway. You have the right to an attorney, Jessica continued as she helped Brenda to her feet. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you. I demand to speak to the real sheriff. Brenda shouted. This is obviously some kind of impersonator. Jessica pulled out her radio and called dispatch. This is Sheriff Martinez. I need a unit at my residence for prisoner transport. I have one in custody for assault on a law enforcement officer. The dispatcher's voice crackled back immediately. Sheriff, did you say assault on a law enforcement officer at your residence? Affirmative. The suspect attempted to arrest me for parking in my own driveway and pointed a taser at me when I identified myself as law enforcement. There was a long pause from dispatch, followed by what sounded like barely suppressed laughter. Copy that, Sheriff. We'll have units en route immediately. As we waited for backup, Jessica started gathering information about Brenda's background and her claims of HOA authority. It turned out that Brenda had moved into the neighborhood just 2 months ago and had immediately appointed herself as the guardian of community standards for our subdivision. Ms. Patterson, can you show me the documentation that establishes your authority to enforce vehicle regulations in this neighborhood? Brenda, still sitting on our driveway in handcuffs, pulled herself up with as much dignity as someone in her position could manage. I don't need documentation from corrupt bureaucrats. I have grassroots community authority. What specific community granted you this authority? The concerned residents who care about property values and community standards. Jessica pulled out her notebook and started writing down everything Brenda said, probably already building the case that would send her to jail for assault on a law enforcement officer. Can you name these concerned residents who granted you authority? Well, the authority is implied by the obvious need for community standards enforcement. I watched Jessica write down claims authority based on implied community need, and shake her head at the sheer audacity of Brenda's logic. Within 10 minutes, 2 patrol cars arrived at our house. Deputies Johnson and Williams got out looking like they couldn't quite believe they were responding to a call about someone attacking the sheriff in her own driveway. Sheriff, Deputy Johnson said as he approached, we understand you have a prisoner for transport? Yes, Miss Patterson here attempted to place me under citizen's arrest for parking my patrol car in my own driveway. When I identified myself as law enforcement, she pointed a taser at me and threatened to use it. Deputy Williams looked at Brenda, who was still sitting on our driveway looking like someone who just discovered that actions have consequences. Ma'am, you tried to arrest the sheriff? She was violating community vehicle standards. Brenda protested. Patrol cars aren't supposed to be parked in residential driveways overnight. Ma'am, Deputy Johnson said patiently, the sheriff can park her patrol car anywhere she wants. She's the sheriff. That's special treatment. Everyone should follow the same rules. Jessica handed Deputy Williams her arrest report. She's charged with assault on a law enforcement officer, criminal trespassing, brandishing a weapon and impersonating an official. I'll have the full report filed by tomorrow morning. As the deputies loaded Brenda into their patrol car, she made one final desperate attempt to salvage her authority. This is corruption. Police protecting police. I demand to speak to someone higher than the sheriff. Deputy Johnson paused at the car door. Ma'am, the sheriff is the highest elected law enforcement official in the county. The only person higher would be the state attorney general, and I don't think he's going to be interested in your parking complaints. After the patrol cars disappeared down our street, Jessica and I stood in our driveway looking at the spot where Brenda had conducted her final community standards enforcement action. Her fake taser was bagged as evidence, and her homemade community enforcement vest lay crumpled where she dropped it during the arrest. Well, Jessica said, straightening her uniform shirt, that was more excitement than I expected when I came home to get groceries. Think she'll learn her lesson? Jessica examined the evidence bag containing Brenda's fake taser. People like Brenda don't usually learn lessons, Mike. They just find new ways to blame other people for the consequences of their own behavior. The next morning, Jessica came home from the sheriff's office with news that made Brenda's situation much worse than a simple assault charge. Mike, you're not going to believe what we discovered during Brenda's background check. What now? She's been arrested twice in other counties for similar behavior. She's not just some delusional neighbor with a clipboard, she's a repeat offender who targets law enforcement officers specifically. The investigation revealed that Brenda Patterson had a pattern of moving into neighborhoods near police officers' homes and then escalating confrontations until she could claim harassment or brutality. She'd filed false complaints against cops in 3 different counties and had even sued one police department for discriminatory enforcement after they arrested her for similar behavior. It gets worse, Jessica continued. She's been documenting our daily routines for weeks. She had photos of you leaving for work, me coming home in uniform, our patrol car parked in the driveway, everything. She was building a case to claim that having a sheriff living in the neighborhood was somehow unfair to other residents. So this wasn't just random HOA crazy? This was calculated harassment designed to provoke a confrontation she could use for a lawsuit. She picked the wrong target. The district attorney was fascinated by Brenda's case. According to Jessica, it was the first time anyone in the county had tried to arrest a sheriff for parking in her own driveway, and the legal implications were going to set precedents for years. The DA says she's looking at serious time, Jessica explained. Assault on a law enforcement officer is a felony, and her pattern of targeting cops in other counties makes this a habitual offender situation. But the story was far from over. 3 days after Brenda's arrest, Jessica came home with an update that made the whole situation even more bizarre. Brenda posted bail and immediately held a press conference claiming that her arrest proves corruption in the sheriff's department. She what? She's claiming that I arrested her to silence her legitimate community organizing and that sheriff's deputies are getting special treatment by being allowed to park patrol cars in residential neighborhoods. The press conference had been a disaster for Brenda, according to Jessica. She'd stood in front of the courthouse with her homemade community enforcement vest and tried to explain why attempting to arrest the sheriff was actually heroic community service. The local news interviewed her and she actually said on camera that she didn't know I was the sheriff when she tried to arrest me, but that it wouldn't have mattered anyway because no one is above community standards. The news coverage had been brutal for Brenda but entertaining for everyone else. The headline in the local paper read, "Woman tries to arrest sheriff for parking at home," and the story included quotes from Brenda about her grassroots authority and community-based law enforcement. The best part, Jessica said, grinning, is that 3 other counties have now contacted us about Brenda's previous activities. She's facing charges in multiple jurisdictions for targeting law enforcement officers. The federal involvement started a week later when the FBI contacted Jessica about Brenda's activities across state lines. Apparently, her pattern of harassing police officers wasn't limited to our county or even our state. Agent Martinez from the FBI called today, Jessica told me over dinner. Brenda's been doing this for 5 years across multiple states. She targets law enforcement officers' homes, provokes confrontations, and then files federal civil rights lawsuits claiming harassment and discrimination. How much money has she made? Over $200,000 in settlements from police departments that didn't want to fight her frivolous lawsuits. She's been making a living off of harassing cops and then suing when they arrest her for it. The federal investigation revealed that Brenda had a sophisticated operation. She would research police officers' home addresses, move into their neighborhoods, document their daily routines, and then create increasingly aggressive confrontations designed to provoke arrests she could claim were retaliatory. The FBI says I'm the first sheriff she's targeted, Jessica explained. Usually she goes after patrol officers or detectives, people who don't have the political connections to fight back effectively. She made a mistake picking on an elected official. What's going to happen to her? Federal racketeering charges. The FBI considers her operation organized fraud targeting law enforcement officers. She's looking at serious federal time. 6 months later, Brenda's trial became a media sensation. The story of a woman who tried to arrest a sheriff for parking in her own driveway had captured national attention, and the courtroom was packed with reporters and curious spectators. Jessica testified about the incident with the professional demeanor that had made her a respected law enforcement officer. She described Brenda's aggressive behavior, her fake taser, and her claims of community authority with the kind of detailed precision that prosecutors love. The defendant approached me in my own driveway while I was retrieving groceries from my patrol car, Jessica testified. She demanded that I step away from the vehicle with my hands visible and claimed I was under citizen's arrest for parking violations. What was your response to this demand? The prosecutor asked. I identified myself as the county sheriff and asked her to explain what authority she believed gave her the right to arrest anyone on my private property. How did the defendant respond? She pointed what appeared to be a taser at me and stated that she had community authority to enforce vehicle regulations. When I ordered her to lower the weapon, she activated it and threatened to use it. The defense attorney tried to portray Brenda as a concerned citizen who was simply trying to maintain community standards, but the prosecution had evidence of her multi-state harassment campaign that made her claims of innocent community organizing impossible to believe. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Brenda was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for racketeering, fraud, and targeting law enforcement officers, plus restitution to all the police departments she'd sued under false pretenses. Mrs. Patterson, the judge said during sentencing, your systematic harassment of law enforcement officers under the guise of community organizing represents a serious threat to public safety and the rule of law. Your actions were calculated, deliberate, and designed to exploit the legal system for personal gain. The best part of the sentencing was when the judge ordered Brenda to pay restitution to our county for the costs of her prosecution and to publicly apologize to Jessica for her behavior. Brenda's apology was delivered through gritted teeth and sounded about as sincere as a politician's campaign promises. I apologize to Sheriff Martinez for any misunderstanding about my community organizing activities, she said in a voice that suggested she was being forced to eat broken glass. I did not intend to interfere with law enforcement operations. After the trial, Jessica and I finally felt like we could put the whole bizarre episode behind us. Brenda was in federal prison, her harassment campaign was over, and our neighborhood could return to normal. But the story had one more twist that we didn't see coming. 3 months after Brenda's sentencing, Jessica got a call from the warden at the federal prison where Brenda was serving her time. Sheriff Martinez, I thought you should know that your former neighbor has been trying to organize the other inmates to file complaints about correctional facility parking violations and prison community standards enforcement. I couldn't help but laugh when Jessica told me about the call. Even in federal prison, Brenda was still trying to enforce imaginary regulations on other people. What did you tell the warden? I told him that Brenda has an obsession with controlling other people through fake authority, and that she'll probably try to establish herself as some kind of inmate ombudsman if they let her get away with it. Has she learned anything from this experience? Jessica shook her head. The warden says she's been writing letters to various government agencies claiming that her conviction was the result of a conspiracy between local law enforcement and the federal government to silence her community organizing efforts. A year later, I was working in our garden when I heard a familiar sound. Someone ringing our doorbell with urgent persistence. My heart rate spiked for a moment before I realized it was just our new neighbor introducing herself with a plate of cookies. Sarah Williams was a retired teacher who'd moved into Brenda's old house after it was foreclosed. She was friendly, normal, and thankfully showed no interest in enforcing community standards on anyone. I just wanted to thank you both for getting rid of that crazy woman who used to live here, she said as she handed me the cookies. The neighbors told me about how she tried to arrest the sheriff for parking in her own driveway. How stupid do you have to be to pick a fight with the county's top law enforcement officer? Jessica came out to meet our new neighbor, still wearing her sheriff's uniform after a long day of dealing with actual crimes instead of imaginary parking violations. Sarah, welcome to the neighborhood, Jessica said. I hope you'll find it much more peaceful than your predecessor did. Oh, I'm sure I will. I believe in the radical concept of minding my own business and letting other people live their lives. As our new neighbor headed back to her house, Jessica and I sat on our porch looking at the spot in our driveway where Brenda had conducted her final community standards enforcement action. Any regrets about how you handled the Brenda situation? I asked. Jessica considered the question while watching the sunset over our supposedly problematic patrol car. The only regret I have is that it took someone pointing a weapon at me before I realized how dangerous her behavior had become. If I'd investigated her harassment of other neighbors sooner, I might have been able to stop her before she escalated to violence. But you couldn't have known she was running a multi-state scam targeting law enforcement officers. That's true, but there were warning signs. The fake authority, the aggressive confrontations, the obsession with controlling other people's behavior. Those are all red flags that someone is potentially dangerous. As we sat there in our peaceful neighborhood, I couldn't help but appreciate how much better life was without Brenda's constant surveillance and harassment. No more fake citations for imaginary violations, no more threats about community standards, no more weapons pointed at law enforcement officers in their own driveways. The irony was that Brenda's attempt to control our neighborhood through intimidation and fake authority had actually made us more aware of what real community looked like. Her arrest had been the catalyst for neighbors to start talking to each other and building genuine relationships instead of living in fear of arbitrary enforcement actions. You know what the funniest part of this whole story is? Jessica said as she watered the flowers that Brenda would have undoubtedly cited us for if they'd been the wrong color. What's that? Brenda spent months surveilling our house and documenting our routines, trying to build a case against the sheriff's department for allowing officers to park patrol cars at home. But she never bothered to research who actually lived here or what my authority was as an elected official. She just assumed she could intimidate anyone with her fake authority. Exactly. She'd gotten away with harassing patrol officers and detectives in other counties because they didn't have the political connections or resources to fight back effectively. But she picked the wrong target when she tried to arrest an elected sheriff. That evening, as we sat on our porch watching the sunset over our legally parked patrol car, I thought about the lesson Brenda had learned the hard way in federal prison. Real authority doesn't come from homemade vests and fake tasers. It comes from legitimate processes, legal documentation, and the consent of the people being governed. Brenda had tried to create authority through intimidation and harassment, but she'd ultimately encountered someone whose authority was real, earned through years of service, and backed by actual legal power. The fake community enforcer had tried to arrest the real county sheriff, and justice had been served with a side of poetic irony that even Hollywood couldn't have written better. The driveway incident had become neighborhood legend, and Brenda Patterson had learned that there's a big difference between imaginary authority and the real thing. Sometimes the best way to deal with people who try to control others through fake power is simply to let them encounter actual power and watch their delusions crumble under the weight of reality. As Jessica always said, the badge makes the officer, not the vest. And people who try to arrest sheriffs for parking in their own driveways usually end up learning that lesson the hard way in federal prison.